What's up, everybody? It's Dan, Binder Boneyard, coming at you from the office, closing out November here quickly. Nice weather, nice day today, Bluebird, getting some work done. Moved in a new shipping container that we will turn into our online sales warehouse. We are expanding, growing, part sales are doing well, so we are expanding. So that's what I was doing today. Figured I'd sit down and do a little something here. The thing I wanted to say first was thank you everybody for following along, for listening, for the Patreon donations, the Instagram subscriptions, that sort of stuff, plus all the sales, all the purchases, everything. Like, it just it goes a long ways. I'm grateful. So, but through, normally I come up with podcast ideas just through my daily life, things I encounter, calls from people looking for tech advice and stuff like that. And I was thinking I hadn't done one on steering in a while. The steering thing comes up occasionally, especially a new Scout owner, and they get the wonderful Wander that the stock Scouts have. And so I was just going to go over Scouts, trucks, Travelalls, and the various types of steering and corrections and whatnot. So starting with the Scout 2 Terra Traveler, pre-1980, the front ends had 0 degrees of caster, which you may have heard that term before. Caster is to put it, I don't know, the easiest way to put it, it's just the amount of rotation the knuckles have rearward. So the top of the knuckle tips backwards. So if you were to put an angle finder on the knuckles of a stock Scout, they will be at 0 normally. Nowadays, they're 55 years old and everything's worn out. A lot of times you'll see them actually rotate positive, where the knuckles will actually tip forward. And that is not good. That's not good for stability going down the road. What that does is it causes a wander over, 45 miles an hour. They start wandering around. So you've heard the term, the cut and turn. That's a very common phrase. If you Google Scout cut and turn, that refers to grinding the welds off of the knuckle, rotating it rearward, 6 degrees or so, and then welding them back on. Not for the faint of heart, not as easy as I just made it sound, but it's doable to your average Joe with a grinder and a welder and some common sense. What that does, though, is it creates caster where the knuckles will, kind of point at each other, but not like toe in. All these front end parts work together. Caster, camber, and toe all work together. So a common phrase that I've heard over the years is less caster, more toe, or more caster, less toe. And that helps, take care of some steering issues. It won't solve the wander that you get from the bad caster, but it will help with like death wobble and things like that. And death wobble is something that I hope none of you experience, but it is a common problem, especially on trucks that have like track bars and coil springs and things like that. When the front end can start moving around, then it creates this phenomenon where the tires start fighting each other and then they just bounce back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and the steering wheel gets pulled out of your hand. And the only way to beat death wobble when it happens while you're driving is to come to a complete stop or go faster, and you'll actually drive out of death wobble. That happens on my black truck occasionally, especially when the tires are worn out. It'll pick up death wobble at weird, bridge junctions and things like that. But anyway, so generally you want that caster. That helps with the return to center. You'll notice on a stock Scout, just as is, you turn the steering wheel and then kind of accelerate, and it will just hold that corner. It'll hold the turn. But if you have like 6 degrees of caster and you go around a corner and let go of the steering wheel, it'll actually want to straighten out. That's called return to center, and it will return to center pretty quick. I don't like going more than about 6 degrees. I see some guys online that are like, 10 is where it's at. Well, most manufacturers that put caster in their front ends, like GM and Dodge, they are around 6 degrees, from what I can tell. Some Wagoneers, things like that, were like 7. But Wagoneers, Jeep did some weird stuff with theirs. They had 2 different caster angles, they tried to account for the crown in the road. So the driver's knuckle would have 3 degrees and the passenger knuckle would have 5 degrees. Just weird stuff like that. So when I do cut and turns here, I try to just set them both at the same angle. But no, 6 is my magic number for when we're doing stock trucks. If it's a lifted, sprung over and lifted. Sometimes I might go like 7 or 8, but no more than 8 ever. And then the 1980 Scouts, because they finally figured out that there was such a problem with this 0 degrees of caster, the 1980 Scouts had 2.5 degrees of caster in the front. And that's what I would consider the bare minimum. So anyway, but beyond that, if you're having a wander and you're having issues, and this is across the board, there's other things to check, like your ball joints, those big socket looking things on top and bottom of your knuckles. Those, if you jack the truck up and you can grab the tire top and bottom and like wobble it back up and down, and if you can watch them move around in their sockets, then they're definitely no good. And that will cause a wander and tire wear and weird handling. If you have a C or D series truck that has closed knuckles, which, it looks like a giant, like a softball or a bowling ball out there on the end of your axle tube, you don't have ball joints, you have trunnions, sometimes referred to as kingpins, but kingpins I like to save for the 2-wheel drive trucks, the 2-wheel drive trucks with I-beams. Those, I refer to those as kingpins. You might hear the term kingpin 60 if somebody's talking about a Chevy or a Dodge front end from the 70s and 80s, or even Fords too. Fords had them, but it's very similar, where if you look at your closed knuckle, you'll see a cap that'll have 4 bolts on it. That goes down into a bearing, and the bearing carries the load. It's a very stout design. And the same on the open knuckle kingpin trucks, like the Dana 60s. They have a bearing or bushing in there underneath that cap. It's a very sturdy design, unless you're doing some really hard wheeling, and then you'll actually break the knuckle. That's a common failure on kingpin front end knuckles. They'll crack because there's nowhere for that stress to go. On a ball joint truck, that'll just pop the ball joints out and save the knuckle. But if it's a kingpin truck, a lot of times it just breaks the knuckle. There's companies out there that sell weld-on gusset kits for your kingpin knuckles. But anyway, so, check that, your kingpins, your ball joints, or your trunnion bearings for wear. Your service manual will have the setup procedure for your trunnions because you shim them to the proper preload. And then, the other thing to look for is your steering leaks themselves. The tie rod, which joins the tires together, that's the bar that goes from one tire to the other, or your drag link, which goes from the steering box to the knuckle. Scout 2s, it's a crossover design, so it goes from the steering box on the driver's side to the knuckle on the passenger side. That long angle helps alleviate bump steer, which is a phenomenon that happens that when your axle travels up and down on, the passenger side, the geometry changes, the length, the distance from the steering box to the knuckle changes because it's going up and down. So, if you were paid attention in geometry class in high school, you understand that it's an arc that swings, and so that means it's changing lengths. And so what happens is, instead of it transferring to the steering wheel, it turns the tires. So as the axle travels down, it would actually turn to the left, and as the axle travels up, it would turn to the right. So you get kind of a wobble swerve out of it when you hit big roller bumps or, things at speed. So the crossover steering design, because it's so long, the bump steer is minimal compared to like a D series or C series truck or Travelall, where it has a push-pull style steering, where the drag link travels front to back, and it's attached to this big horseshoe or this arm on the steering knuckle, and then in turn, turns the whole truck. That way it has worse bump steer because the drag link is so short. Most of the drag links in the C and D series trucks are like 16 inches long. They're very short. And what happens is you get this bump steer phenomenon that happens with them. It's pretty aggressive. And the only way to fix it is to either convert to crossover steering, which is hard on the D series because there's an oil pan and there's stuff in the way. And it's just mounting is hard. It's just crossover steering only works on a full size if you got a bunch of lift and, drop pitman arm and things like that. Which then brings me to the other thing. Guys try to limit bump steer with like drop pitman arms, which does help flatten that tie rod out. Drag link out, but it limits your turning radius. There's a phenomenon that happens when you have a pitman arm with a drop to it. It doesn't travel the same arc, and it can limit turning radius. So try not to do that whenever we can. One thing I see in scouts when guys do spring over lifts is that they go with the old Binder Planet Bill Hamilton Z bar, which is a bent drag link to help get around the springs. That is not something I would consider proper or correct. It allows for a lot of flex. It's not great for off-road. I've seen more than one guy fold a similar contraption over on, hard wheeling, especially if you have a front locker or big tires. It's just not, Z-bars are not ideal. I don't like them. Every truck that comes in here with one, I won't run it. We go the proper way, which is what people call high steer. High steer is when you attach a steering arm to the top of the knuckle on the passenger side, and it raises that drag link above the spring. It takes away the bump steer, It makes everything flat. It's a straight line, so it's very sturdy. And then your tie rod can also move up and be high for ground clearance, especially in safety in the rocks and off-road. Or you can leave the tie rod down below in its stock location. But running high steer requires that you change the knuckles, because you can't just weld something to the knuckle. It really is, you really need to run a flat top knuckle, which is common in the C series, common in Chevy and Jeep applications that had Dana 44 fronts with open knuckles. A lot of them had flat top passenger knuckles. They require machining. There's a way to go about that. You can Google that process, or you can buy them brand new from places like Parts Mike, or IH Parts America, or Reed Racing. They sell already done flat top knuckles. I recommend everyone run those. That's just the way it goes. Every Scout I've got here, every Scout 2 that I ever have done a lift on, always gets a flat tops and high steer. It's just the best way to go. It is the end all correct way to do steering on a lifted, sprung over Scout. So you don't really have that problem with a D series because you're not going that high. If you're going for a big lift on a D series, and you want to do crossover, you usually have a flat top knuckle on the passenger side already. So you can machine it to accept that high steer arm. But yeah, it's D series stuff it's kind of its own animal. But yeah, pay attention on your stock setups, your tie rods and your drag links. Watch out for play and slop in those. A lot of those aren't manufactured anymore. You have to go with an aftermarket upgrade. We sell new tie rods and drag links on our website that have modern joints that bolt right in, that are heavy duty and sturdy. And they'll last you, another 40 or 50 years usually, especially if you grease them like you're supposed to. The other thing about steering stuff that you'll notice is steering can cause weird tire wear. It can cause death wobble. It can cause lazy handling. Just it's really important that your steering components are all in good shape, new, not sloppy. Make sure that your steering box is secured to the frame well. It's common to see Scout 2s with cracked frames around the steering box. That's why there's various companies sell supports and braces and weld-on things to correct that. So it's important that the steering boxes are placed. The D series ones, it's funny. The 1200s, the brackets are just bolted to the frame. The 1300s have a sleeve inside of the frame that the bracket bolts to. So if you want to stiffen up your steering, you can make some bracketry to go inside the frame rail on your D or C truck. The C series stuff had rams for power steering, which was very powerful, but not. It's finicky and fragile, and I don't recommend people run them. They're very expensive to rebuild, and it just the ends are obsolete and very expensive. So I try and recommend anybody that wants power steering on a C series to try and find D series bracketry and steering box and go that route, just because traditional Saginaw gearbox is going to be much easier to rebuild and find, and it functions how you want. So yeah, I try to avoid that C series RAM and Sense RAM setup. It's complicated and unnecessary. So what else? I get asked a lot about putting power steering on 80s and 800s. 80s is hard because of the 4-cylinder and it's inside the frame rail. If you rig up a pump setup, you can use like a Jeep Cherokee box. They have a rearward facing pitman arm, and they just fit under the frame depending on how you put them in. The other way to go is like a F250 two-wheel drive F250 box, because it has a really long sector shaft, and so you can bolt it up to the frame there and kind of position it where you want, and then make a bracket and bolt it on. And it seems to hold up pretty well. I've done that on a couple now, and I've wheeled one, my 63 Scout. I wheeled hard with that, and yeah, it held up. So yeah, the 800s is a little easier because it's outside the frame rail. So, most guys just do a Scout 2 box. 800s with a V8. 800s with the 4-cylinder is still inside the frame rail and has the same problems as the 80s. But the 6-cylinder and 8-cylinder 800s, steering box is on the outside of the frame. You can use a Scout 2 box if you make a plate and drill some holes. And then, or the F-150 box. That's the common one now that everybody's doing, because Scout 2 boxes are getting so hard to find. Then the only thing you have to come up with is the bracketry for a pump. If you're doing power steering on an 800 with a V8, do not use Scout 2 stuff. Use, as far as engine bracketry goes, use the D-Series truck brackets and pulleys, because it puts the pump up high, gets it out of the way. And you try to do the Scout 2 stuff, you have to run it off of the crank, and it hits the fan, and then the box is the pump is into the inner fender, and just there's all kinds of clearance problems. But when you do the D-Series setup, it puts it up high, it's out of the way. It's a pump with a big can, lots of reservoir. So it's the setup that we do across the board here for the 800s. So yeah, and as far as putting power steering on like a C or D that did not have it, it's real straightforward. D-Series power steering stuff is out there. Get the bracket, get the box, get the engine brackets. There's 2 of them. There's one that bolts to the head, and then there's the one that bolts to the pump, and then they bolt together. So make sure you get all of your bracketry. Make sure you get a example hose so that your hydraulic shop can make you the correct type of steering hose. You will also need the pulley that's on the water pump. There's a small little pulley that's at the base of the water pump stack that you will need to run that power steering if you have a C or D series. So don't forget that. But anyways, that's how I do it here on all of these that we do. So again, it's try to use the international stuff when you can, because retrofitting something else just ends up being such a drama fest, trying to manufacture brackets and make stuff work and get things together. It's almost easier. And I know international parts are harder to find, but if you get them, have the box rebuilt, the pumps you can buy brand new, like once that stuff's in there, you shouldn't have to mess with it for at least a decade. And if it was rebuilt once, it can be rebuilt again, usually. So, that's what I recommend, is that there might be a little more legwork, but going with the stock IH stuff, you're going to have a better experience in the long run. Especially if you sell the rig later, the second buyer isn't going to have to scratch his head and try to figure out what bracket and what pump and what you were doing and any of that. You can just use as much factory IH stuff as possible, and then it's easy to identify later to the general IH person. So that's my recommendation on that. So that pretty much covers most of the steering stuff. Hopefully that made sense. I'm sure I glossed over something, or I have a tendency to talk about stuff like everybody's an expert and we're all just agreeing, instead of you guys are learning and I'm spouting off. So if there's anything you need, just hit me up. Let me know. But I appreciate everybody, and I thank you for listening. And until next time, I'm Dan from Binder Boneyard.